Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our online training on building the public sector workforce of the future. I'm Emily Jarvis, and here at GovLoop, I'm our Senior Online and Events Editor, and today I have the added pleasure of also being your moderator, so thanks so much for joining me, and a special thank you to our partners at Cornerstone for helping us put this training on today. So what exactly are we talking about? We all know that technology is changing at a faster rate than ever before, and that government agencies can't continue to find new talent or resources to keep up with the latest tech trends. This causes technology to outpace employees' knowledge, which directly impacts the skills gap and available talent. So what on earth can agencies do? That's what we're going to delve into in today's training. And the good news is we've got two great experts who are going to share their insights on how to properly prepare your employees for the changing landscape of work. But before we dive into that awesome content, I do have a few housekeeping items to go over. We'd like this training to be as interactive as possible, so please share what you learn on Twitter using the hashtag GLTrain. The person who tweets the most using that hashtag will receive a super soft GovLoop t-shirt. Trust me, you definitely want it. Speaking of that console, we have a wealth of resources available for you to download, including this slide deck. We hope you don't have any technical difficulties, but if you do, shoot a message to the Ask a Question box, and my colleague Steph will make sure to get all your questions answered. And please take a moment to fill out the feedback survey on the right side of your console. We appreciate your feedback and are constantly trying to improve your online training experience. I'd like to encourage you today to ask lots of questions throughout the online training. Look for that Ask a Question box right there on the side of your console, and we'll answer as many questions as we can towards the end. Finally, we are recording this training, and we'll email you a link to the on-demand version so you can share it with your colleagues or view it again. All right, with all of that pesky housekeeping items out of the way, let me introduce you to our speakers. Joining us today, we have Nicole Blake-Johnson. Nicole is the managing editor at GovLoop. In her role, she writes and leads the development of in-depth reports and online news articles for the government community, particularly in the tech space. She also writes a bi-weekly series on GovLoop called The Intersection, which focuses on stories at the intersection of people and technology, obviously a very apt name. And when she isn't writing, Nicole enjoys spending time with her 16-month-old son, Devin, and her husband. Joining Nicole, we have Tom Tonkin. Tom is a performance-driven, high-energy, and customer-focused executive with more than 20 years of leadership experience, spanning organizational and leadership development, coupled with hands-on technical success. He excels at devising and implementing strategic learning and development programs for customers, such to maximize their return on enablement investment, all while maintaining awareness of current developments in the field of training and enablement that provide value to our customers. Wonderful. Thank you both for being here. And Nicole, I'm going to start with you. You just wrote a few guides on GovLoop that are very pertinent to this topic. One is on human resources, another is on government trainings. So obviously we are very thrilled that you are here with us today. We're talking about the public workforce of the future, but I think it would be useful if you could set the groundwork for us. What does the public sector workforce look like right now?
So thank you for having me on. The good news is there is a lot of data out there to help us track and get a sense from a number perspective what the workforce looks like across government. It's a little easier in the federal because you can head over to the OPM website and use tools like they have like FedScope and kind of get dynamics of what the federal workforce looks like. On the state side, sometimes it's a little more difficult to track as a whole across states, but I'll call out Washington State, for example. They have a lot of great data analytics on their website that provide a breakdown of what their workforce looks like. But when you look at the data of the federal workforce, the average age of a federal employee is about 47 years old, and it's been that way for quite some time now. I think 47 years young is not old at all. But what's interesting is that you have dynamics when you look at age groups younger than that 47 to 47.5 range, as well as older. I know that probably a lot of the viewers right now have seen the changes happening, especially with federal workforce reform, and really the push to look at not only the size but also the cost of the federal workforce and agency. So there was quite a lot of conversation about early retirements and early outs, and looking at employees who are actually taking those and looking at where they were in their career and what that meant in terms of would it be good to take the early out or should they stay on. And so there was that dynamic at play happening at the federal workforce level, as many agencies were looking to shrink the size of their workforce. But looking at the state and local level, one of the things that I saw a lot of in my reporting was not so much that there were a ton of states looking at early retirements, but what they were more so grappling with was, once employees retire, how are we doing the retirement payments and the pensions? Like, do we actually have the budget? And they were struggling there with the finances on how much employees should contribute and how much employers should be contributing to the retirement. But one of the encouraging things I can say is that with different programs on board that the government has, bringing people into government for 2-year stints from the private sector and other places, you are seeing that dynamic where you have younger employees coming on board who may not generally have been looking at a career in government, but they have a passion for the mission and want to get involved, providing an opening for them to come into government, not, committing 10 years, 15 years, but looking at 2-year stints. And, speaking to a lot of chief human capital officers in government, that's what I'm hearing from them, that you have to rethink what your expectation is as an employer for how long employees will be staying on in government. So instead of, mapping out, I might have this employee for 5 or 10 years, saying, I might only have them for 2 years or 3 years or maybe even less, but what can we get done in that short period of time in terms of us investing in their skill sets, but also them, investing in what we're doing at the agency level.
Awesome. So I want to touch on one thing in particular. You said, that there are a lot of retirements happening, and I hear this phrase all the time, the retirement tsunami, that people are going to be retiring in droves. And while we're seeing those retirements happening, it's not a tsunami quite yet, but the government really is getting older, right?
So, like I said, old is relative, I'd say, but one of the challenges I think is that you do have folks who started. I've met people who started off GS 7s or even lower and have worked their way up and have been in the government for years. And they've built up these skill sets and knowledge. And the challenge for agencies is that these people have, in a sense, become institutions because they know more about the agency than even some of the managers who are there. And it really, is a challenge for agencies once those people leave to kind of fill in the holes of the knowledge gaps that they've had. So I'd say in general, what's interesting is when I look at like the percentages of employees who are like 65 at retirement age or older, that number, when you look at current stats from the end of 2017, is actually less than what it was the previous year, which is, a lot of things could have happened. Either people have left voluntarily, or they've taken early retirements. So that's kind of, based on the data, what we're seeing. But yes, I'd say when you compare the government workforce to private sector, yes, you're seeing a lot of older employees. But when you look at the data and kind of drill down a little further, that average age really has stayed somewhat the same. But to your point, I haven't really seen the flood or tsunami of people just leaving in droves, but it's something that's really top of mind as agencies are downsizing. People really have to think, do I want to stay on, or am I leaving? And we are seeing people leave.
Gotcha. So I want to hit on one other thing that you said. You were talking a lot about the retirements happening, and that, some people are only coming in for a couple years on details or things like that. So obviously that means that the government is in the need of recruiting and retaining some new talent. Any insights from the guides that you've written on what successful agencies have done to be able to get some fresh faces into the government?
Yeah, so a couple of things I'll hit on. One that I'll highlight is last fall around November, the federal government held its first IT cybersecurity career fair, which was really neat for a couple of reasons. One, we know that cyber and IT are critical positions that government's really trying to fill. And so when you talk about aging workforce and employees, one area, yes, where employees tend to be older, and as these people are leaving, you need to refill those positions with employees who can come on board and fill those gaps. And so what was neat is that there were some like 1,800 job seekers who were there. The place was crowded. I was there for a few hours. From 40 different states, you had hiring managers from 33 federal agencies, including 5 from the intelligence community. So to have all of those people in one place where people could come to really interface with government, because a lot of time their first and only interaction they have, if they happen to make it to an interview, is through USA Jobs. And so to be able to talk to people face to face to get a sense of, what is their mission, to ask questions, was really interesting. I saw people there, very young looking. It's hard to tell these days. I can't look in the face and tell how old they are. But there were people I talked to who were high school students who were there, who were college students, who were, maybe you're not getting hired on the spot there at the career fair, but they're engaged. And that is huge, to be able to see that all the way up to all different age ranges, race, gender. It was pretty amazing to be there. And it was nice because they had the agencies themselves had hiring managers. They had the folks there to start the security and clearance processes, which is really nice because that can be a stumbling block for government. I've heard from people who have said, I was really excited. I got an email. I'm moving on to the next level, but I was ready to start working and hadn't heard anything back from government for months, and in the meantime got poached by a private company. So I think to see that there are efforts to move the hiring process along faster, to really engage with people in different states. I saw some teachers there who were interested in cyber jobs, wanted to work at the education department because she said she's really passionate about education and she wants to ensure that students' data is kept secure. I was like, that's pretty amazing. So that was nice to see. And one thing I'm hearing from agencies too is for a lot of them, when they were in a place where they were not able to hire, where there was that hiring freeze, they really made it a point of duty to keep the potential candidate pool engaged. So if it's either like checking in every now and then, sending them materials about the agency, but not just like letting go of that. Once you've, have all of these excited job seekers who are engaging with your agency, like it can't just be a one-time thing. You really have to find creative ways to, keep them engaged, whether that's through social media, sending them cool information about what your agency has going on, I think are all great things to do.
Definitely. As I get older, I feel like everybody around me just gets younger and younger, so I like that you can't see age anymore as I get older. Last question for you. You talked a lot about how governments are trying to engage, especially an IT workforce. What about the people who are already employed by the government? What efforts are underway to keep them trained and engaged going forward?
Right. So a couple of things there. I'll list off that I have heard from people at agencies that have seemed to work and been very effective. First off, offering flexibilities, whether it's something like an alternative work schedule where an employee works, hours through the week and they're able to take every other Friday off, something like that. Telework, I know that's become quite a hot topic issue again, but really looking at first, it's not work is not where an employee is located, whether it's at a desk or at their home, but it's really what they do, and if the job could benefit from telework in terms of giving employees that flexibility to work from wherever they are, but to still get their work done. I do understand the value of engaging with your coworkers, seeing people face to face. I'm a proponent of that. I'm in the office today. But, really looking at getting to know your employees and what things they value. As a mom to a 16-month-old, if I were to be looking for a job in the federal government, that's something that would appeal to me, like knowing if he had a doctor's appointment that I could work at home a little in the morning and then come in later. Like those things are important. I saw coffee times. That's something we do here at GovLoop, but also in government, where it allows people to engage with their employees, whether they're in the same office or virtually, to connect and talk about, what area of the agency are they working in? What projects are they working in? Where are there synergies that we can work together? Because sometimes you don't even get to know the employees that are down the hall, from your office or from your desk because you're so heads down and don't always get up to engage with people. So that's a nice way to get people engaged and helped. I heard also giving employees responsibilities, whether that's them working on a project, but then that they have let's say they're in IT, but they really also have a passion for data analytics, like finding ways for them to weave data analytics and IT together. How can they use that to drive the mission of what the IT department is trying to do or working on other projects? I also like the idea, and I've heard this happening at different agencies, is kind of that 20% time initiative where employees who, obviously they've done a stellar job on the work that they were assigned and required to do, but let's say they have passion projects that help them to feel fulfilled but also benefit the agency. So giving them that freedom to work on things that might be outside of their normal purview, but like I said, still adds value to the agency but helps them to feel engaged and connected. And one thing I would also mention is sometimes this is overlooked, is just communicating with employees and telling them they've done a good job. Sometimes we make engagement way more challenging than it has to be. When for some people it's words of affirmation. Those are the things that make them feel connected and wanted. So I think understanding how your employees feel valued, how they like to be praised or shown appreciation is very important. And on that piece of communicating, I mentioned the workforce reforms that were happening. Talking to some of the chief human capital officers, for them it was something as simple. I'm saying as simple, like this isn't a challenging thing to do, but having town halls where you invite people to get involved, to submit and ask questions, and you're being transparent. I think that's the big thing, especially when an agency is going through tough times like, staff reductions, or they're not hiring, or there's a freeze, and that really has an impact on morale. When people feel like you've been open and honest and transparent with them, I think that absolutely goes a long way. So I heard a lot of that happening across agencies, just to have people feel connected and that their voices were heard.
Awesome. That is some great insight that really sets the groundwork for a lot of what the public sector is experiencing. So thank you so much, Nicole. So I do want to encourage you guys to keep sending in your questions. We're going to reserve some time towards the end to address those. But right now I am going to turn things over to Cornerstone's Tom Tonkin. So Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you. And Nicole, thank you so much for all that you have talked about today, because it really sets, like Emily said, right, sets the groundwork for what it is that we're going to talk about. The context of the situations that are going on in government today, and what I like to do is I want to go ahead and start sort of at a much higher level, because much of what happens in talent management as a whole, or pretty much anything that we're trying to change in any kind of organization, whether it be public sector or private sector, really is externally focused. What's happening in society today? And what's happening is back in early 2016, the World Economic Forum kind of decreed that we were beginning or in the middle of this next industrial revolution, the next workforce revolution. And for reminder's sake, probably it's not one of those topic of conversations that you get into very much around workforce revolution around the dinner table, but there are the other ones here on the screen. And the way we kind of measure how we move across those is what advances have been made in three specific areas: communication, transportation, and energy. And anytime those three fundamental things change, and mind you, they usually change because of technology in each of those three, we kind of get this renaissance or this renewed view of an industrial revolution. And so in essence, right, we're getting out of the computer automation and networks. By the way, it's not out of in the sense that we're no longer doing those things. There are some things that we are no longer doing, or at least things that are going to subside over time. I can see a time here in the not so distant future where driverless cars will be something that happens on a daily basis. And so that's kind of where we're headed. And so what I want to do is I want to take a minute here as we dive into this understanding that things are changing, and therefore also much of your workforce is also changing as far as the expectation is concerned. You heard Nicole talk about an aging workforce, and you talk about the fact that, again, the idea that, and we're talking specifically about baby boomers, hence the name baby boomers means we had a boom in babies back in after World War II, and what's happening is they're all going to retiring. We haven't had that spike, and that's where we are. Is we have not only an aging workforce because they're retiring, living longer, but we also have a new workforce that's kind of sort of taking over, and that's across multiple generations. As a matter of fact, arguably at any given time, you can see 5 different generations working together hand in hand. So what are some of those expectations that employees are coming, especially those younger employees coming in? Right, the idea of continuous lifelong learning. Right? People want to continue to improve. Right, they want to be empowered in their career development. I want to be able to know where I want to go. You heard again, Nicole, talk about some of these things, such as the ability to commute, having a young infant at home, and having her ability to move around, right? So not only that talks specifically about her job, but it also connects to the ability for her career development. Real-time performance feedback. I think that's one of those labels that we like to use, but I also would like to add my perspective on that suggests that many of us also want just to be acknowledged on the work that we're trying to do. Not only feedback itself by saying yes, good, yes, bad, but the fact that you're putting effort towards something. And again, I go back to how does that look like in some other organizations, especially in the federal government. We're talking about this 20% time, this passion projects, as Nicole mentioned earlier. That's what we're talking about is having that acknowledgement and providing some feedback to that. And then lastly, we can't really escape the fact that much of what we are relying on for our decisions comes from data, and that idea of providing not only the sort of the big data and the analytics that we've all talked about, but how to now that that's actually like fodder. That's like that's table stakes, right? The idea of having an understanding of what data is coming from. So now do we move forward, start talking about predictive and prescriptive analytics and all that comes with it. So a lot of this is happening not only from an organizational, institutional perspective in private and public sector, but also those expectations as we move forward. Now, what I find interesting is when you combine all of this stuff that's happening, you now see that jobs are changing. And it was interesting. We went out as we were putting this slide together to say, well, what are some examples? And each one of these jobs that I'm showing you, these are like real jobs that you will find. The one that I find fascinating is this idea of this culinary product developer, right? So it's a combination of somebody that knows how foods all get paired together, but also be able to package that as a product and sell it. You can imagine where some of those organizations and would have such a person, right? Those prepackaged meals that go out. It's not enough to be able to know how to put the meal together, but also how to package it. So you see a lot of these jobs are more like hybrid, not even hybrids, they're like synergistic in different scale, bioinformatics, right? This person that knows a lot about biology, but also knows a lot about data and what can we learn forward. So all of these things are actually getting pushed on because of technology. So as we then combine that, and then this is what I would consider my obligatory millennial slides. It's very interesting that I don't think I have to sort of beat this too much into people's heads about the fact that millennials are now the largest generation on our planet. Therefore, it's arguably going to be the largest generation in the workforce. I will say, though, that I don't necessarily prescribe to this huge difference generational gaps as far as attitudes is concerned. I may be going against the grain on some of that, and maybe I'll have an opportunity to address that in the Q&A. Because if you think of the external forces that are placed on millennials, they're not much different now than they are, say, baby boomers. For example, I kind of chuckle. All of my children are millennials. I have a 33-year-old daughter. who now has a mortgage and has a full-time job and lives in a house. And, sometimes I wonder, like, who's the oldest out of the two of us? I seem to be a little more carefree than she is lately. So there's these external forces on it. So therefore, I don't necessarily prescribe on that. But nevertheless, there is this idea that we have this new set of expectations, this new set of folks that are coming in. So we have to kind of address that. So understanding that as fundamentals, as the changing external forces in our society continue to act on us, it was rather interesting to start looking at what are some of the more futuristic leaders saying about what's going to happen in, say, in the next biggest impacts that we'll have in the next 10 years, right? So I've got a few quotes in here. I'll pull some out. I would say the speed of technological progress, right, as a popularity of the Internet of Things. I'm going to tell you something, and this is going to get recorded and posted, and today's, I think, is April 24th, and we're going to put it on YouTube, and maybe if we're all around in 10 years, it'd be interesting to come back to this presentation to see if this is all accurate. I personally believe that this idea of the Internet of Things and how we're all kind of connected is really going to have a tremendous impact on how we start moving to potentially the 5th, 6th, and 7th industrial revolution, and it's going to go very, very fast. There's an interesting quote from an economist as I'm sitting here presenting this to you that I'd like to pull out that basically says something along the lines of, we're finally getting to a point where the human race is having a hard time adapting to the technology. So in the past, technology, for example, if you take a look at the television and when it first came out, and again, I don't have the exact numbers, but I'm going to say it probably took a few decades before you could say that the television was ubiquitous in everybody's home. And so human thought, cognitive processing kind of hung in there, if you will, with the maturation of the television. It went from black and white to then to color TV, to remote controls, to like moving now into moving to cable and so on. That seemed to be fairly easy. Obviously, we can go even back further. The telephone, as a matter of fact, it was interesting for those that may remember party lines. My wife grew up in a neighborhood where you had a telephone. It was a party line, right? You actually shared the line with other homes. So sometimes you'd pick up the phone and somebody would be ready to use it. Hey, and you knew your neighbors real well, right? That's back in the old days where everybody stayed in the neighborhood for 30, 40, 50 years. And you'd say, oh, Joe, let me know when you're off the phone, right? And it was interesting, right? So that technology, right, it took a real long time. We're getting to a point where new technology comes in, and the human experience is having a really hard time keeping up with those changes. Even those that are younger, maybe have dealt with technology at a very young age, like my children, they even find themselves sometimes getting behind. So the synchronicity or lack thereof synchronicity between human adaptation and technology adaptation is starting to err on the side of humans. I'm sorry, of technology. So given everything that I've talked about up until now, including what Nicole had mentioned earlier, I'd like to spend just a couple minutes and get some feedback here around, what is the strategy, if you have a strategy of attractive young professionals. Emily, I'd like to bring you back into this conversation and go through
the poll. Yeah, I think this is great. So obviously, we've got the poll up on your screen right now. To make your selection, you're just going to simply click in the slide window, and your options are yes, no, in development, not sure, or other. Got to have that other in case there's a caveat. And we're going to leave this poll up for about a minute or so that you guys all get a chance to take it. And while we do that, Tom, we got a great question in here that relates to what you were just talking about. It says many agencies are making an effort to recruit new tech-savvy younger workers, but that doesn't necessarily always sit well with the older generation or the old guard that has been doing this work for a long time and knows the inside out, has the inside knowledge. How do you kind of weigh those two needs? You need new workers, but you also have to keep the workers that you have engaged and happy. How do you think about that?
That's a question that gets posed a lot of times. I mean, I go back to a story that I had many years ago. This was back in the 1980s, and I was actually selling technology around ERP, right, Enterprise Resource Planning. And the gentleman that I was selling was the CEO of a company who had grown up in the company, and he was at the time in his mid-60s. And I was talking about deploying an ERP in 2 years, which right now people would laugh me out of their office if I told them that. But this guy was incensed because he had built the ERP in 1963 or something like that at that company, and it took him 10 years to build. And for me to come in and suggest that I could do it in 2 years, I was lying, and I mean, it was really a challenging meeting. So I can see the vitriol, if you will, that gets built by this animosity. One thing that I have seen, and again, it's attitudinal, because what are we really relying on our older generation on? We're really relying on what I call institutional knowledge or corporate knowledge. Right? There's something to be said about understanding where things have been, so you can explain how things are today. They're not necessarily somebody that potentially would bring any kind of current tech savviness in them, because again, we've kind of boxed them into that. And so my suggestion is there's a very nice mix between having the ability to share knowledge. You have somebody who's younger and potentially more current on the trends of technology sharing with that older person what they know, but having that older person come back and say, look, I've been here for 20 years. Let me give you some of that institutional knowledge. And I think that's mutual respect that occurs. It's attitudinal, and both add value. And I think sometimes we tend to put value into one thing and not into another. And I'm going to suggest that sometimes I think we put a lot of value into knowing the technology and very little value on that institutional knowledge. What I think we need to change that paradigm.
I think mutual respect is really the key. A millennial isn't necessarily going to come in and always save the day just all the way. So it takes two parts of that equation. So I think that's critically important. All right, let's go ahead and push the results of the poll. And it looks like a lot of people are unsure or no, or it's somewhere in development. Does this resonate with you, Tom?
It does, because I think one of the reasons I wanted to ask this question and have this a little bit of a dialogue is the way you would know is by seeing the reaction of your young professionals in an organization. And what I found is when you ask this question, and most people do say not sure, by the way. And the reason they say it's not sure is I think there's a lack of conscientiousness of whether or not there's a strategy in place. It's not that there isn't any. I mean, one would suggest that if you're not sure, there are basically a couple conclusions. Number one, you don't have one because you don't see any evidence. But most likely, what's really happening is there isn't a conscientious view of that. It appears to me, again, going back to what Nicole said, right? The idea of some of the retention things that she mentioned, like teleworking and coffee time and the 20% time, they kind of lend themselves to young professional kinds of needs. You remember, for those that are boomers, and again, there's no secret here from the picture earlier, I am a boomer. I'm on the fringe, the young fringe of the boomer. I grew up in a place where you sort of woke up in the morning and you put your suit and tie on and you drove to whatever place of work and came home and reversed it all out and did that 5 days a week. Where working at home it was a luxury, and believe me, I enjoy it very much, that flexibility. But I think nowadays you see, like, for example, my children growing up, they've seen me working at home. Most of them work at home, and so that's now become it's not even a thing, right? It's not something unusual. It's something that's probably more usual, ubiquitous that you would find. So again, my takeaway on this slide is for those that are not sure and others is take a look around, ask the questions, and see if there is something in place, because obviously the question is kind of leading in the sense that you probably should have something in place.
Awesome. Well, I think we are on to the next part of your presentation.
Yes, let's continue. So now that we've laid out all of this, I want to start honing in what it is that we can do to bring this forward, right? So we're talking about the future of work, and arguably some of this is future work. Again, the survey goes out from PwC to over 10,000 members, and they ask the question, what will transform the way people work over the next 5 to 10 years? Sure enough, what would you think but technological breakthroughs? Remember what I said earlier about the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about communication, energy, and transportation. Those are the three things that actually are the way we measure how we move forward. And you can arguably see that technology is the one that's going to move that forward. What I find very interesting here, too, is the second one, which is resource scarcity and climate change. I don't want to get into another type of discussion, but that lends itself, again, to climate change does have effects on those three things as well: communication, transportation, and energy. As far resource scarcity, right? The fact is, I think it was Exxon that Mobil or OPEC or some large oil organization that basically says, at the rate that we're expending fossil fuels, we probably about have 53 years left in the world of fossil fuels before we're kind of out of those things. Now, good news is it appears as if within 40 years, we're going to be the world's going to be completely independent of fossil fuels. So that's good news for us. But my point is, you could see how rapid these things are changing in that particular landscape. Now, talking about technology, talking about this other stuff, one fact that I thought was very interesting that every time I talk about is this technology is going to push people out, right? So 80% of people in this particular future of work study back by Burson in 2017 were worried that something like AI, artificial intelligence, and in this case I'm using it as a catch-all for technology, will increase unemployment, right? They're going to take over my job. But if you go back in history and take a look at this, right, technology actually created more jobs in the last 144 years than anything. So we want to welcome technology. Now, the interesting part about all of this is the fact that potentially that job that you have may not necessarily be needed, but there's going to be multiple other jobs that get created because of that. And therefore, we here at Cornerstone keep talking about this industrial revolution is being what we call the skills economy. So skills, right, is the new currency of people moving. How are you going to get that culinary product development job or whatever other job, especially in the government world, right? What are going to be those jobs that are going to come to fruition, because of some of those technological impacts? So what are some of those things that are changing, right? So being digital, I think that's old hat. I think everybody understands that that's just digitizing will continue. Something that is sort of near and dear to my heart is the adoption of design thinking, something that I have a lot of passion and speak about a lot. The specific part of design thinking is really around empathy towards people, right? So far, a lot of technology has always been sort of system-oriented. I think the fact that people can code and technology advances, we really need to change that focus more to people. Innovation continues to be a key differentiator in how we do things. I think innovation is moving from being a competitive advantage to table stakes. Two aspects of innovation is the requirement of diverse thinking and in good communications within that diversity. And so sometimes we think of diversity and inclusion as being one of those compliant things, but I'm going to tell you, I think that becomes the competitive advantage. Being diverse gives you that competitive advantage. Employee engagement and well-being, right? The idea of not only engage within in work, but their health and wealth of that employee. And lastly, this idea of multiple constituencies working together. Obviously, we've been very good at vertical integration, but I think the horizontal integration within the organizations are key on impacting how we're going to work as a future. So the idea now moving forward as I traverse, well, not traverse, I'm actually going deeper into this discussion around developing those particular skills and future-proofing your organizations is the emergence of learning experience platforms. The fact is that we go home and many of us sort of put on Netflix or Hulu or whatever it is that we do to consume content. I'm still a paper book guy. I'm sorry. I've been to Kindle, but I'm still a paper book guy. But I know that there's a lot of discussions around. I know my kids always. We rarely watch the television anymore, right? It's more online types of things, and that becomes a way we consume content at home. Why should it be any different when we get to the job place? Why should we consume learning content or any other content in some different way? So we see some convergence there. Virtual and augmented reality is now a thing of the present. I actually was at a symposium I got invited called the Institute for the Future, a pretty fancy symposium and institute we work with here at Cornerstone. And I actually got a chance to look into what virtual reality for learning actually was. I got in there and I was able to put on a set of goggles. It was sitting in a classroom. It was amazing. And there it was. It was here today. That's certainly going to become ubiquitous as well. On demand for high fidelity video-based learning. Right? Back in the old days where you look at video and you kind of think, well, I'm on a modem. I better not run video and this take forever. Those days are over. There's an expectation that this stuff can run very, very quickly. And then lastly, this idea of artificial intelligence and where all of this is coming to be able to not only do what's called content curation, but I'm going to introduce a term called content insight. I won't get into too much of that as I look at the clock on the wall, and we can move forward with this conversation. Okay. So, Tom, I've been sitting here listening to all this wonderful stuff. How am I going to approach this? How am I going to future-proof my organization? Well, I'm going to steal a few questions from Sir Richard Branson, who talks about this a lot. I actually follow him in LinkedIn. He's got a lot of really, really good insight. It's interesting. He's been very successful in the airline industry, which arguably is one of the most challenging industries because he's been very, very innovative. Right. So some of the questions I would say is the organization offering brand value as well as brand name. I realize that we're talking to the public sector, but I still didn't want to shy away with that because whether we think of this or not, we all have some kind of brand, whether it be your own name or institution. There comes some stereotype to it. I know that when I talk, for example, in the manufacturing industry, I don't know if everybody remembers the GE commercials. They weren't too long ago where the young man graduates and gets a job with GE, and his dad hands him a sledgehammer and says, "Here you go. Here's your grandpappy sledgehammer. Now go be a manufacturer." And the guy's, "No, I'm going to be a computer programmer and I'm going to integrate these things." He's like, "Oh, you can't pick up this sledgehammer, can you?" "Well, that's okay, son. We can work on that." And there's this brand, right, of manufacturing, this sort of old-time stereotype view of things. Well, if GE, the whole reason they went and did this commercial is because they want to rebrand what manufacture is. Right, managers be complacent in the sense that we continue to do things over and over because we did them before. This is that whole aging workforce thing, and having a little bit of respect with each other to the fact that we both can bring value together and move organizations forward. Therefore, are your employees becoming bored with what they're currently doing? And is nostalgia blocking the innovations? I remember the good old days of fax machines. I remember when I first saw a fax machine and I thought, what? Hold on a second. I'm going to put this piece of paper in, press a button, and another guy's going to get it. I couldn't believe it. I actually called him on the phone. I said, "Is it really saying what it's saying? Read me the first sentence." But is nostalgia blocking from innovation? People like to gravitate to that, to the back. So these are some of those tough questions that you should ask yourself as you move forward. And this quote that I wanted from Henry Ford I wanted to show is because sometimes the people that you serve may not necessarily have a perspective of what it is that they want. So you as, in this case, right, I know the citizenship is really your customer. And maybe the citizenship may not necessarily know what they want. And so you kind of have to ask yourself and be innovative from within to say, maybe there's a better way we can do it, even though the citizenship is not necessarily paying attention. So then lastly, as we sort of start rounding the bend on this, is 4 tough questions to ask about your KSAs. Now, again, knowledge, skills, and abilities for your roles. And this is coming from the CDC, right? What kind of knowledge is required? Remember, we talked a little bit about some of these new roles coming in, and this hybrid and these emergent sort of synergistic roles coming together. What knowledge is now going to come? As a bioinformatist, not only do I have to know about biology, but also about data science to be able to do my job, right? What are the guidelines we are used to accomplish work? Now, right, there's a combination here between effort and effectiveness. Right, so we can certainly get the work done, but is it effective? Is it worth doing? I think it's one of those questions I don't think we ask ourselves. I know I sometimes don't ask myself. I find myself very busy sometimes, checking stuff off my to-do list, saying, have I really moved the needle here for our company? How complex are getting the roles? The roles are getting complex, right, because there's a lot of moving things. Remember I told you earlier about how technology is now getting to a point where the human race itself is having a hard time adapting to that technology. Again, I'm sure there's all. I remember seeing a particular graph that showed how the adoption of the television and the telephone, and then how long it took, and then the adoption of the internet, and then adoption of social media, and how quickly the adoption of these things are getting. And that's meaning end users. I think like if Facebook, for example, if Facebook were a country, I think it's the 3rd largest country in the world, like with over 1 billion quote unquote inhabitants or citizens. So it's all moving rather quickly. And then lastly, how does the work of one role affect another process or role, right? The interdependence. This is very prevalent, by the way, in healthcare, where specialties continue to emerge because there's so much research and so much data around the healthcare, especially like how do you cure things or how do you treat people? I remember going. My wife had a total replacement shoulder surgery, and she went for a checkup, and she got another doctor for a checkup, and we asked him, does he do replacements? He goes, no, I do. He does like the patching. He doesn't replace. This other guy replaces. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, right? Back in the old days, right, it would just be like the shoulder guy. Now you have multiple types of people going on. So how does all of this interdependency affect each other? So closing it out very quickly. 3 critical factors for success. Focus on the continuous process improvement. I'm also going to suggest that includes not only the process but the people. If you go back to the old economist ways of how do I measure productivity, it's usually tools and people. Those are the 2 things that economists look at from measuring. The next-gen automation, right? Robotic process automation, workflows, natural language processing, all the things that help us automate the things that need to be automated and can be automated. And by the way, that's increasing, and I have lots of different examples of that. Lastly, the user experience, right? The idea of not only do I want to connect each other, but think of the talent management user experience. Like, how do you acquire? Back in the old days, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, when you hire somebody, their experience with your company kind of, or your organization or institution or your division, department, always started like on the first day. Well, that's no longer the case, right? It really starts, much earlier in the recruiting process and how they connect it and how they move through that recruiting process. I know my daughter just went through a process, and it was, I got to tell you, much of the process was kind of broken for a particular job, and it really kind of sort of turned her off to the company as a whole. There's a perspective here that journey starts much earlier. So, as I want to be able to take some questions before we close out. Love the quote from Peter Drucker. I have a bromance with Peter Drucker, and basically says, right, the best way to predict the future is to create it. You've got the capability, the autonomy that we currently enjoy because of technology has never been better. It's never been better place to be in talent management and HR. And I am truly excited to see what the future holds. And with that, Emily, I'm going to turn it back to you for any kinds of questions. I know I went through quickly, but there's a lot of good data here that I wanted to share.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tom. And we do have quite a few questions in already, but if you've got one on the tip of your tongue that you want to ask Tom, which is a little bit of a tongue twister in itself, feel free to go ahead and submit those questions now. So, Tom, first up, we got a great question that says, do you think that by so many people being able to work from home instead of coming into the office, we're losing some of those verbal interactions?
Oh, yeah. We're losing the tonality and the physiology. So if you take a look at research in itself and you take a look at what's the 100% of communications, right? We have 3 ways to communicate it. The words I use, the tone that I use those words, and my physiology, my look on my face. Obviously, if I were to break those out, the words themselves are only 7%. The physiology, actually the tone, is about 53%, and the other 40% comes from physiology. So yes, so if I had to, was that 93%, I'm losing if I'm just trying to communicate with people through, say, email or text. So it's only 7% of the meaning of communication. That's why I think sort of just purely having this webinar in an auditory form already moves us to 60% of what you can hear my tonality, you can hear my voice. I think that, and therefore I think I spoke about this earlier about video being a very important part of not only the learning process, but certainly how we would communicate to people. So, you know, in other webinars as we get to do this and maybe others, right, turn on the video, gets to see people interacting. So correct. And so I think providing those percentages hopefully makes a little more sense as to where I think the technology will lead us. But as you know, a lot of this technology is in place. Whether or not we use it, it's up to us.
But if we did have a video, how would I do this in my pajamas, right? I would have to get all ready.
I would have to shave.
So what you guys are really missing out. Exactly. Awesome. All right. So my next question in here says, what do you think about purposeful mentoring between an older, maybe a baby boomer, and a person who is of a younger generation? I know you talked about sharing that knowledge. What about formal mentorship?
I concur. I do here at Cornerstone. We have formal programs, and I happen to do some mentorship with younger folks. And I got to tell you, I don't think I ever walk away without learning something myself. And I think that's the part that I think we miss is when we think of mentor-mentee relationships, we think of them as being very one way. And I'm going to tell you, if they're one way, you're doing them wrong, because that turns into more of a giving somebody direction as opposed to learning, right? A mentor relationship is about learning, not about guiding or direction. You got managers, you got a bunch of other bureaucracy out there to do that. Mentorship is about a two-way communication, like I said. And when you see that, when you walk away as either younger or the old, like the mentor or the mentee, and you've both learned, that you got your win-win. So yes. And I think that stems back to what I said earlier about the idea of mutual respect.
Definitely. So I have a person in here who is requesting just a little bit more information on what you have already touched on. And it says, can Tom talk a little bit more about the meaning behind the terms being digital and vertical integration? Tell us a little bit more about what you meant there.
Yeah. So being digital is taking everything from content to workflow to communications to finally devices, I just lost the term there for a second. So let's walk through it here for a second. So you go from content, right, which is files and videos and all that. I think we've all kind of figured that out. And the problem with all of that is became I forget, I think what the rule is like the internet content on the internet is like growing by 36% every year or some ridiculous number like that. And that's all fine and dandy, but the problem is all the context that you might lose, right? You might look at a piece of content and say, well, how does this fit? What does it mean? This happens all the time, actually more so than you would expect. I remember working on a project. This was many years ago where we were just excited to digitize content. And this is for a very well-known news agency that I'll keep the name to myself, where we were trying to tag the content as it came in real time and displayed on the screen as new. And the tag, the headline of this particular article, so what happened was you had a person type the article and then submit it into the system, and the system would read the text and then would dump it into a section of a portal. And it was something like lions maul the bears or something like that.
Okay.
And right. And what happened was somehow that got tagged to the Detroit Lions football team beat the Chicago Bears. And what really was happening was a video of a lion mauling a bear. And it ended up in the sports news. And all of a sudden, no one knew, and all of a sudden you had these little 8-year-olds going, oh, let me go to the sports section. And there's this huge outrage of this video. So all of a sudden you get this context and all of the taxonomy that goes with it. So then when you move to workflow, okay, well that we got to fix that, right? That can't happen again. And so my point is you move the digitization up that value chain to workflows and eventually to devices, right? So now we have not only do we have devices, where we wearables, if you will, that tell us a lot of data about ourselves, but we also have hashtags and things like that in integration from a social media perspective to tell us. There's a great project coming out of the UK. Actually, it was the government there in the UK who now has a particular thing that if somebody was depressed and they tweet something like some depressive thing that they tweet, you now can be part of a program that connects that tweet back to your closest friends and family. So then they get a tweet back and say, hey, look, this guy just tweeted this depressive thing. You may want to give him a call so you make sure that nothing bad happens. So that's what I'm talking about, digital, and that's called the project. So I think it's called Good Samaritan something. It's on the Twitter platform. But again, you've got this vertical integration, right? That's happening is how do all of this digital stuff happens in a verticalized integration, right? You have a technology stack that's all integrated. And then what happens horizontally, right, is all the different disciplines that could take advantage of that vertical integration. Does that?
Got it.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Plus, I love any story that involves bears and lions, so I really appreciate that. So we've got about a minute left here, and so I want to give you an opportunity to kind of share some closing thoughts. You and Nicole both talked a lot on this training about a lot of what is happening right now in the public sector. If the Govies who are listening to this training today could take one or two tidbits back to their bosses or their teams, what would you like them to have as their takeaway?
There's three assertions or statements I like to make. I think the first one is, and I think sometimes we segment this idea of private sector and public sector, and it's not really the same. I think I think that's going to be convergence. I think those artificial. I think because we all live in the same planet Earth, we are all affected by these externalities. The expectations are changing rapidly, And so therefore the tagline is, or the thought is, that we're getting to a point where technology is moving much faster than the human race can. And so I think there's an awareness that we have to take away. Second is, even though we have this awareness and we have this technology moving, I think there's a lot of things that we can do about it to maintain a dominance over that. The fact is that technology is still an enabling thing. The question becomes, what is it enabling? Right? That's the one that's still up there, right? I mean, it enables good things and bad things. I talked about the Twitter thing earlier about Good Samaritan. The fact is that now we have this data on some server somewhere. Could, say, an employer or could an insurance policy see somebody that be depressed and use that against them? Who knows, right? So my point is, there's still a governance around morality and ethics that we need to maintain. And then lastly, the trends are moving so fastly that I would suggest you continue to inform yourselves on what's going on. There's a lot of really, really good data. There's also a lot of data that is suspect. Learn critical thinking skills. Learn your ability to discern what's good and what's bad.
Wonderful. That is a great way to wrap us up. So thanks so much, Tom. Unfortunately, though, that is all the time we have today. I do have a few quick reminders before we sign off. We will email you a link to the on-demand version of this training, so make sure you check your inboxes tomorrow. Also, don't forget to check out all the resources available for download in the resources section on the right-hand side of your console. Please take 2 minutes to fill out the feedback survey. We're always trying to improve our online trainings and greatly appreciate your thoughts. Our goal with these trainings is to help you do your job better. We really appreciate and value the work that you do every day, so thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon. On behalf of Nicole, Tom, and myself, I hope you enjoyed our online training, and a special thank you to our partners at Cornerstone for helping us put it on. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you at the next GovLoop training.